Well, I guess it was inevitable that I would end up talking about a Disney sequel on this channel. But let's give the Disney sequels the benefit of the doubt for once, since most of the internet seems to hate them. I, on the other hand, think that there are some of them that are actually quite good movies. And I don't just mean they're good, but are actually genuinely great. And one of those is the subject of today's video, Peter Pan Return to Neverland. Or technically just Return to Neverland? Or is it Peter Pan starring in Return to Neverland? Why couldn't they just call it Peter Pan 2 or something like that? Then everything would just be so much simpler. Anyway, some of you may know that a little while ago, I made a video talking about why I happen to think that the original Peter Pan movie is kind of overrated, and is not exactly the all-time classic that some people make it out to be. But today, I'm going to double down on that opinion, because I happen to think Peter Pan Return to Neverland is the better movie. Yes, in fact, I think basically everything in this movie, more or less, is better than everything in the first Peter Pan movie. I mean, even the animation, you could argue. I mean, it's at least on par with the original movie's animation. Like, they actually got some really talented people to work on this movie. It certainly wasn't just a cheap cash grab that was rushed out to make some extra money. And in some ways, it's kind of ironic that I think this sequel movie here, which was probably commissioned at the very least in order to make more money, arguably had more heart put into it than the original production, dare I say? Anyway, that's enough delaying the inevitable. Now, if you're willing to give me the chance, I would like to explain why this is my opinion. First off, let's just get one thing clear. There's nothing in this movie that's worse than it was in the original movie. As in, the things that I did like about the original movie are still just as good in this one. Like I mentioned before, the animation is still great. Captain Hook and Mr. Smee are pretty much just as iconic as ever. In fact, some of my all-time favorite Captain Hook and Smee lines are from this movie. Like, you are lying to me if you tell me that this scene right here isn't one of the most clever things you've ever seen written into any movie.
You said no one would get hurt. You gave your word.
And Captain Hook is a man of his word. I promised I wouldn't harm a single hair on his head. And... Ow! This is the one I won't harm!
The voice cast is also impeccably chosen. Pretty much every replacement voice actor, since all the originals had pretty much died at this point and had to be replaced, are excellent choices. They fit the characters just as perfectly as any of the original actors did. I even think that Corey Burton as Captain Hook may even come off as slightly more menacing than the original.
You're doing the right thing, my dear. I'm your only way home.
Anyway, another aspect that many people may immediately look at this movie and think it's a downgrade is the fact that the crocodile is nowhere to be seen and we have this octopus instead. However, I hold the controversial opinion that this octopus is in fact better than the crocodile ever was. I think he's far more expressive and funny. And I love the way that every time he looks at Captain Hook and his crew, he just sees them as giant codfish, which is just such an amazing design choice from the artists. I also think he's just a much bigger threat as well, being, well, ginormous. And I love that he's only after Captain Hook, not because, like with the crocodile, Peter Pan cut off his hand and threw it to him, but because his own plan backfires on him, trying to get the octopus to eat Peter Pan, and instead accidentally giving the octopus a taste of himself. And, you know, that kind of leads me nice into the next section, which is that Peter Pan is no longer a psychopath. Yes, that is right, this movie fixes Peter Pan as a character, and I know there's some people out there who like psychopath Peter Pan, but I am not one of them. I much prefer this movie's version of Peter Pan, and Tinkerbell for that matter too, though she's still a little bit psychotic, but much less so than the first movie. And that's because they still keep the most important traits of their characters, while also being able to be much more likable as protagonists that we could actually root for, since they essentially just dropped 90% of their sadistic traits. Like, there's a couple of minor moments here and there that are nowhere near the level of anything in the first movie, like when Tinkerbell knocks Jane off of Peter Pan's back and she falls for a while before Peter Pan catches her, and he laughs at this idea, even though there's the potential that she could have fallen to her doom. But like I said, it's mostly pretty minor moments like that, and not big scenes like the mermaids trying to drown Wendy while Peter Pan just laughs hysterically watching, doing absolutely nothing, and then just saying it was all a big joke afterwards. The Lost Boys in this movie are also much better than they were in the first movie, because they actually have much more defined and distinct personalities. They were borderline interchangeable in the first movie, whereas here, you could actually tell who's who just based on the way they say things and do stuff. And the shenanigans they get up to are just a lot more interesting to watch on screen, like visually speaking. Once again, credit to the animators. And also on the topic of design choices, I also think that Neverland itself as a location is significantly better in this movie. Like, I just get this feeling every time I watch the first movie that Neverland feels kinda small and not really that magical or interesting, whereas the version of Neverland in this movie feels way more grand and vast and adventurous, with a certain air of mystery to it. I love that the sky above Neverland isn't just pure blue skies like it usually was in the first movie, but has these color hues like green here and there, which really make it feel like Jane has entered into another world. Oh, and speaking of, that would bring me to the primary reason that this movie is much better than the first. Jane and her entire character arc, and the thematically powerful moments in it. As I mentioned in my review of the first movie, I thought that Wendy, John, and Michael were pretty boring protagonists for the most part. None of them have any progression or character development whatsoever to speak of, and usually just get boiled down to one or two basic character traits, like John being the proper British citizen. And due to the fact that Peter Pan and Tinkerbell were psychopaths, it really didn't leave you with many options for characters you'd actually want to root for. Like, it feels like when you're watching the first movie, you're just watching a bunch of characters doing stuff. But it's really hard, at least for me personally, to get emotionally invested in the story. And it is such an enormous contrast to the second film here, because Jane is 10 times better than any of the main characters from the previous movie. Like, not only does she have an arc and character development and stuff, but she has a much more interesting personality to watch. Like, she's feisty, gets emotional easily, is severely homesick at one point, and is always trying really hard to be the smart, strong, and dependable person for the rest of her family to lean on, even though she doesn't fully understand what that actually means or how to pull that off, coming off as kind of mean-spirited and overly cynical and serious about everything. You could argue that Peter Pan, at least, I don't know about the other characters, was a flawed protagonist in the first movie, but the big problem is that the first movie does not address the fact that he is so flawed. His flaws don't mean anything to the story, because the movie just lets him get away with all his problems and never even brings them up like they are a problem in the first place. Whereas here, it's obvious from the start that Jane needs to learn a lesson, and that her flaws are holding her back from what she should be like, because she's grown too cold and distant and unkind to her family, all while trying to have their best interests at heart. Because she doesn't understand a problem that I see several people in real life still don't understand to this day. The problem of fake maturity. When people tend to act like they're smarter, older, wiser, less childish, and other various assortments of descriptions about themselves to try and come off as someone who's grown up and is a part of the real world now. But in reality, most of the time, when people act like this, they tend to be overcompensating for their own lack of wisdom and knowledge. The reason they desire so much to be accepted as mature is because they believe that everything childish is bad, and they don't want to be associated with something bad. So they try to hide any aspects of themselves that are like that, and dismiss anything related to those ideas. But this is not true to who a person really is, and most of the time, it just makes people come off as jerks and overall self-obsessed, because they act like their opinion on matters is the only one that, well, is the only one that's worth listening to, because everyone else is just childish and doesn't know what they're talking about because they're wiser and older and they understand things better. And this is what Jane has developed into. But it's also not hard to understand why this happened. She's flawed due to the circumstances of her own world, making her that way. She was born into a world of strife, and the constant wars and fighting have made her lose all hope. She's broken. Her rejection of childish things is partially based on the fact that the childish stories, as she calls them, of Peter Pan are there to give people hope, to dream of better times and of ideas like never growing up and having fun all day, every day. But to Jane, she just sees these stories as telling a lie to someone that will never be true. She doesn't see any value in these stories because if you tell someone all these magical, wondrous things and then they don't turn out to be true, they'll be heartbroken for the rest of their lives. And that's the exact thing that happened to her. She's just trying to protect her little brother from realizing the same thing she realized. But she's missed something incredibly important about these stories. That it isn't about trying to tell people that impossible things will happen. The reason Wendy tells her children these stories to give them this hope is because she knows that without any hope whatsoever, nothing will get any better. If people just accept that the world is terrible and terrible things will always happen and nothing good will ever happen, then they'll never go out and make good things happen because they don't believe it's possible to change anything.
Because unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better.
And so, Jane's adventure in Neverland has far more thematic meaning than anything that happened in the first movie, because it's about her discovering the joys and innocence of her childhood that she's lost, and why it's important to remember the good times and to always live with hope. Or should I say, faith, trust, and pixie dust. Oh, and speaking of, one little plot line I quite like in this movie is the bit where Jane says that she doesn't believe in Tinkerbell because she's still in denial about the value of these quote-unquote childish things. And it causes her light to start to go out, aka, die. And I love this detail because there's actually this moment in the original play in which a similar thing happens to Tinkerbell and the audience is supposed to say they believe in fairies to stop her from dying. So this is technically a source material accurate detail. In fact, the very existence of Jane is also book accurate because she appears at the very end of the book. Just want to let you know that Jane is not a character that was invented just for this movie. She's actually a real character that J.M. Barrie invented. Anyway, I should mention the actual development of Jane's journey to accepting the fact that she doesn't need to pretend to be mature all the time. And that it's okay to just live in hope and wonder with the innocence of a child. There is a little bit of an issue in how she gets to that point because the main push is this song right here.
We're rolling in dirt, and we won't change our shirt.
And yeah, if you can't tell, this is probably one of the worst songs that Disney's ever put into any of their movies. And not only is the song just kind of bad, but her change of heart does feel a little bit rushed, and it's my only significant issue with this whole movie. Like, everything else is just about perfect, but this one bit here could have been better, let's just say. But it's worth suffering through to get to the climax of the film, which is a pretty solid climax. It works much better than the first movie's climax, in my opinion, because it is more emotionally satisfying. The first movie was basically just a big fight between the Lost Boys and Captain Hook, except I don't care about any of these characters except Captain Hook, except he's the one who has to lose, so yeah. Here, though, I do in fact care about Jane. In fact, I actually care about Peter Pan, and a little bit the Lost Boys as well, too. And this scene never gets old, by the way.
Be brave, lads. Don't let them see you cry.
Since this is the moment when Jane finally flies, something which she had to learn to be able to do in order to be able to leave Neverland, which is also a really clever plot detail, since she's essentially trapped in Neverland until she accepts her misbelief and changes for the better. But the best part of this moment is the outstanding music score. I mean, just listen to this. And did I mention, the music in this movie overall is really, really good. Like, this might be one of, if not the best, musical score for any Disney sequel. And even generally speaking, one of the best musical scores for any Disney animated movie, in my opinion. And I guess on the topic of music, I should also mention the song. No, not that one.
We swing from rope to rope, we have no use for soap.
The other song.
Another plan to try to capture Peter Pan.
No, not that one either, although that one is pretty funny, I will admit. That song.
I try, but it's so hard to believe. I try, but I can't see what you see. I try.
Which, for some reason, there's a certain vocal group of people out there who say that this song is bad because it's quote-unquote a pop song or whatever. Like, I don't care if it is or isn't a pop song, or what people are even trying to say by that. Like, is pop music bad or something in your opinion? Because I happen to think the song is pretty good. I think it's good at conveying Jane's emotions during scenes where she's not actually talking. And I don't think it would make sense for her to sing like in a normal Disney musical kind of way. She's just not one of those kinds of characters. And there's just not enough other songs in the movie for it to fit in with them. And fun fact, there was actually going to be a fourth song that Captain Hook sings at the end when they capture Peter Pan, but it got cut. And thank goodness, because it is not that good. And lastly, to round off my thoughts on this movie, I have to bring up the ending. Specifically, the part where Peter Pan reunites with Wendy and sees that she's grown up. Like, it's a really short scene, and not even that many words are spoken, and yet it's so powerful. I mean, first of all, the background music is amazing, but second of all, I love this bit here.
You changed. Not really. Not ever.
This is so powerful in my opinion because it shows that you can be mature and still have that childlike sense of wonder and innocence. Because growing up, becoming truly mature doesn't mean leaving that stuff behind. It just means expanding who you are and letting new stuff in. And knowing when the appropriate mood and time is to be serious or to be fun and silly. And it really reminds me of one of my favorite Fourth Doctor quotes of all time.
There's no point in being grown up if you can't be childish sometimes.
And honestly, that Fourth Doctor quote there pretty much sums up the entire theme of this movie. And it's a much more fitting theme for the overall story and ideas of Peter Pan in the first place. And really, that at its heart, plus everything else I've mentioned, is why I love this movie, and why I think that it is the superior overall Peter Pan film. Of course, I must give a massive shout out to all my patron supporters and channel members who've chosen to help support me in an extra way compared to normal. And an especially big shout out to EJ Waywalker, my ultra iconic patron. Don't forget to check out my social medias using the link in the description down below, as well as my gaming channel if you're interested in that kind of content. I don't post often, to be fair, but I do put a lot of effort into the videos that I do eventually release on that channel. Oh, and if you missed a video on why Peter Pan is overrated, then you can check it out right here. Or if you're not interested in that, then I have a whole playlist of various Disney-related videos. And I'm sure one of them you'll like, hopefully. Anyway, the most important thing of all is to always remember to be iconic.